Max Keiser, and you are on the edge. Time now to turn to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Roberts is an economist, author, and now a blogger at paulcraigroberts.com. He was Assistant Secretary in the Reagan administration. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, welcome back to On the Edge.
Thank you, Max. Glad to be with you.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, it's a secret trade deal. Talk about it. Who benefits? Why should we care?
Well, it's a 1% of power tool, Max. And who benefits is not completely clear, but certainly it removes corporations from accountability to government. And therefore, it gives them independence of being governed. But who really does benefit? And that depends in part on what the definition of a foreign firm is. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that American corporations would want foreign firms to have more rights inside the United States than they themselves would have, unless a foreign firm includes an offshoring firm, in which case the American firms would have the same position inside the United States as the foreign firms, because if offshoring firms are included in foreign firms, then this at least would take away the question why American corporations would want to support a bill. You know, there's 600 of them advising this secret process. Why would they support a bill that gives them a disadvantage in their own country? So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what the definition of foreign firm is in the bill. Some other points that we could make about this before we assess it. If you look at the agreement, it's Australia, Brunei, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Chile, and Peru. But the importance of, say, Brunei or Chile or Peru operating in U.S. markets is probably not very great. But it could be a way of buying the corporation and setting up the corral around China. Vietnam, of course, makes a great deal of sense of that because it's got a large population and it would be a great place for the Americans to have bases against China. So that is a possibility that it's a base search.
Right. Let me jump in here for a second because first of all, let's be clear. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, is a trade deal that's been negotiated in secret, and it gives corporations, once again, unilateral rights above and beyond any kind of rights that one might hope were enshrined in the Constitution. And Dr. Roberts, this is, of course, coming on the heels of some other very favorable legislation for corporations, the Citizens United law that was passed that gave corporations unfettered access to campaigns with money. Also, we just have Obamacare, which is passed in the United States, which again gives corporations the right to directly tax citizens in America. They don't even have to go through the government anymore. The pharmaceutical industry can just tax people directly and take their money directly. Again, a huge giveaway of rights and powers to corporations. Dr. Roberts, is there any end to this? And if there is, what is the end play of this? Because it looks rather disturbing.
Well, you know, they call it a trade agreement, but it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with trade. It has to do with what you just said. It's putting corporations outside the law or giving them the power to decide about those laws that affect them. And part of this is the free market ideology, Max. And the free market ideology that got going with the notion that markets are self-regulating so we can deregulate the financial industry. In a way, this is another step because in the free market ideology, making a business adhere to a regulation is a taking. You're taking away the property or the profits of the business. You're imposing a cost. It has to comply with the regulation. And what this TPP does is it gives this corporate board the right to force the governments to pay for the cost of regulations that they impose on the company. So if a company comes in and says, well, this regulation is costing me X million a year, then the government has to refund that. So it is a way of continuing this sort of ideology that corporations essentially should not be subject to regulation, and that any regulation is a taking. Now, there's a tendency to say, look, they're letting the corporations take over the world. Well, think about this a minute, because the official ideology in the United States is that we're the only superpower, and the goal is world hegemony. Think about the neoconservatives. They're very powerful. The neoconservative Project for a New American Century essentially calls for the American empire, not for a corporate empire. So I don't think the neoconservatives would want to turn government over to corporations.
How does the President of the United States get away with deferring to U.S. corporations in this way? It's bad enough that he defers to the UN when trying to work out his foreign policy, but how does he get away with deferring to foreign corporations? I mean, that seems radically anti-constitutional.
Well, everything that's been done for the last 10, 12 years has been radically unconstitutional. I don't know that the Constitution is any longer a check, but the question remains. It's a good question that you ask. Who benefits? That's not a clear answer to that. Now, as I said earlier, if foreign corporations include the American firms that are offshore, then they are not, and these are the powerful firms, then they are not disadvantaged by having Brunei and New Zealand and Singapore and Chile and Peru have special rights in the United States, because all of their offshore enterprises also have special rights in the United States. I do think, Max, another part of the story could simply be this is just a continuation of this mindless free market ideology that corporations should not be interfered with, and interfering with them costs the money, and so the government has to pay for it if it interferes with them. All kinds of other groups may be tagging on to this for their own reasons and agendas. And I do think that it's entirely possible it's also part of corralling China, getting China surrounded with bases. You know, we have now declared that the new policy is to move the focus of the U.S. military to the Pacific, and we're reactivating former bases, we're building new ones. So this may have something to do with that. And I certainly will admit that on its surface, it can also look like another step toward some kind of global governance.
Okay, well, certainly there seems to be a trend toward a global governance, global banking, and this is another plank in that kind of initiative going forward. And of course, when you use the term free markets, it's a bit of a misnomer because we're not talking about free markets. Because free markets implies competition. But these types of trade agreements snuff competition. They push competition to the side, and they bring in this oligopoly, this kleptocracy. But I wanted to talk a little bit about something you've written on your blog, paulcraigroberts.com, entitled Silent Spring for U.S. Now, Silent Spring, of course, brings up Rachel Carson's 1962 book, where it was a polemic against industrialization and for the environment. Have you become a squishy, soft environmentalist, Dr. Roberts?
You know, the point of the article is that the external cost of production, which are not included in the cost, are things like the destruction of water resources, the destruction of the soil itself, the pollution of air. There are all kinds of economic activities that have these very serious external costs that are not included in the cost of production. the fracking destroys all kinds of water resources. And since these costs are not included in the cost of production, you have no way of knowing whether the output is worth as much as the cost, since such a huge part of the cost aren't counted. And this is a great failure of economics, and that's because when economics started moving along as a discipline, the world wasn't very densely populated. The technologies were nothing like as toxic as they are now. And so it was convenient to simply ignore these costs and to treat the use of natural resources either as waste pools for pollution or to exploit the mineral and other resources. This guarantees the way they measure GDP, a rise in GDP because they're costless. And so I'm just trying to call attention to that and to point out something that's also consistent with your point of view, that the corporations are getting more and more power. And we have now had scientists say that it's impossible to go up against Monsanto on things like genetically modified seeds because they control the research. They control the departments where the research would be done. The EPA has no independent sources other than the industry studies. And so it is all just part of the sort of the corporation saying we want less and less accountability, less and less. And I think that's clearly what the Trans-Pacific Partnership does. It essentially removes them from any regulation because the governments are not going to have the money to pay up all of the costs that the corporations bear from regulation. And so they'll just have to dispense with the regulation. So this is, in effect, a development in the opposite direction of what we need. We need to start thinking about what these external costs are, how expensive they are. You know, when you have huge dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, from the runoff, from chemical farming, those dead zones are not included in the cost of the farming or the price of the farm products. And as long as you can send off your costs to third parties or to the environment, then you can have more profits. And lots of activities become profitable that otherwise would not be if the full costs were considered. And so this, I think, is getting worse with this Trans-Pacific Partnership because it essentially removes corporations from accountability to government. In that sense, it's a step away from global government because it's saying these people are removed from being governed. We don't govern them anymore.
Okay, so to follow up on the Silent Spring for U.S. a bit, you're not referring to, let's say, what Rachel Carson would talk about in terms of environmentalism for environmentalism's sake. You're pointing out that what the economists call the externalities of these economic activities, the costs are so grave, so high, that it's causing problems that are completely unsolvable in terms of the ability for the economy to absorb these problems, and the underlying economic models themselves have ceased to make sense. To give you two examples, of course, in the area of fracking, it takes 5 or 6 units of energy to extract 1 unit of energy in fracking, so it's a net energy loser. Similarly, the U.S. economy, for every $7 of debt is required to develop $1 of GDP growth. So again, it's the arithmetic of losing. Now, let me just ask you this, though, on the environmental front, because, of course, you were active during the Reagan administration. And what do you suppose would Ronald Reagan make of the current phenomenon we see, which is that the climatologists 20 years ago predicted we'd see incredible wildfires and droughts. At the same time, we see flooding and incredible downpours. With that, exactly what we're seeing now in Florida, in Colorado, maps exactly what climatologists said 20 years ago. And we've had 20 years now of man-made global warming denial and perpetrated by outlets like Fox News and others. What do you suppose Ronald Reagan would make of this? He seemed like a pretty sensible guy. Would he be in the camp of let's realize these external costs, or would he be in the man-made global warming denier camp?
Well, I suppose the answer to that would be, who has his ear? But I do agree with you. It's something that he would have noticed and would have listened to arguments about. I don't know how he would have made up his mind. I don't think he would have been influenced by campaign contributions on this type of matter, because he would see it as a real thing and serious, and he was too old and didn't care about campaign contributions. So we would probably have had a more serious examination of it than we have now. But you see, with both parties so dependent now on campaign finance, and with the Supreme Court ruling that you referred to earlier, that the corporations can buy the government, it becomes almost impossible to deal with these external cost issues. And that's what scientists have said. Last year, a professor of agronomy or microbiology sent a letter to the Department of Agriculture pointing out that it was impossible to do any research because Monsanto buys the faculties.
Okay, let me ask you about another toxic spill in the global financial environment. The global financial system is ridden with toxic derivatives, and they're spilling out all over the place. In London this week, we saw Barclays Bank fined $200 million for rigging the LIBOR market, the international interest rate setting market, therefore global interest rates in toto, affecting a multi-hundred trillion dollar market. What are the implications of this crime, Dr. Roberts?
Well, you can ask the same thing about the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. They're also rigging interest rate markets. And I think, in my opinion, some of the large banks, the reason that there have been no prosecutions or indictments is they serve as part of the rigging of the Treasury bond market and the rigging of the bullion markets. Anytime, the world community gets nervous about, say, Western economic policies and the price of gold and silver start going up, the order goes out to short the market. And these large Wall Street firms just sell naked shorts.
Okay, let me just cut in right there and ask you something about 1987. Ronald Reagan was president. Alan Greenspan was running the Federal Reserve Bank. On the day after the crash of 1987, these groups got together and created the Working Group on Markets, which then on October 20th, the day after the crash, stepped in and bought S&P futures contracts to stabilize the market. Do you see this as a significant development in the role of government in interfering with markets? It's called the plunge protection team now. Is some people even deny the existence of the plunge protection team? You were in the Reagan administration. Is there such a thing as a plunge protection team? Is it active, and is it participating, and is part of the reason why these markets are no longer free is because they have now being overrun by government interference?
That appears to be the case. I mean, no one called me up and told me that, yes, we're here and this is what we're doing, but that appears to be the case. But I think it's gone far beyond that. That had to do with equities. I think now you see, look, J.P. Morgan has something like $70 trillion of interest rate swaps. When you sell an interest rate swap, what you're saying is, okay, I'm going to pay you a variable rate and you pay me the current fixed rate. So if you sell one, you're assuming that the interest rates are going down. Well, obviously, if you sell 70 trillion, they are going to go down. It's like shorting in a way. It's going to drive up the bond prices. And we see every time there gets to be a worry about all the monetization, all the debt creation, all of a sudden the interest rates go down. They get less and less. And we have a situation where last week, or last week, I think it was, the Fed announced it's going to buy $400 billion more in Treasury bonds, but it's going to concentrate on a 30-year bond. So it's going to try to drive the 30-year interest rate down lower. Well, when you have interest rates on long-term bonds that are far below even the official measured rate of inflation, which itself is an understatement, why would anybody bond a long-term bond when the minute you buy it, you're losing? And you face terrific risk that all this will blow up and the bond prices will collapse as interest rates rise. So it has to be rigged. It has to be rigged. And if you look at all of the policies that are going on, whether here or in Europe, the whole approach is to create more debt and to monetize it with more money. Well, that should send bullion prices sky high. So who's shorting the bullion markets? It's not a normal investment response to the situation. It has to be manipulated. There's really no other explanation for it. There's no reason. See, every time the demand for physical bullion rises, they naked short it, and they offset that rise that would push the price up with naked shorts. And I think this is what they're doing in the bond markets. They keep those interest rates so low by selling these interest rate swaps. And so if that's the case, then the plunge protection team goes beyond whatever its original boundaries and now includes Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and who knows who else.
All right, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Edge.
Glad to be with you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.